A macro is a set of instructions to ease in a scripting language so that you can automatically control and manipulate the program. There are a few ways to make and run a macro, but the most straightforward of these is with the macro window. So select New Macro from the Macros menu in the main menu bar, and that'll bring up the macro window. Assuming that no macros already exist, a new macro named Macro1 will be created. The new macro will be empty when it's created. And you can create as many macros as you like. To create another macro, just select New Macro again from the macro menu. And you can see here that each macro is then identified and accessed by a tab with its name that appears here at the top of the window. If you right-click in the macro window tab, you get this pop-up window, this pop-up menu. And with this pop-up menu, you can do a few things, but one thing you can do is rename the macro if you would like. You can also save the macro. You can save it in two different formats. One way you can save it is just with the ease file itself. So in that case, that every time you open this ease file, you will have this macro because you've saved it with the file. But the other way you can save it is as a separate file, and that's called an EMF file. So the extension would be .emf, standing for ease macro file. By default, when you create a macro, it's going to be saved with the ease file. But here I'm going to go ahead and save macro2 as an EMF file, and you can see that now the name in the tab changes to macro2.emf. The advantage of saving the macro within the ease file is again that it's going to be automatically opened and ready for use whenever you open this ease file up. However, the disadvantage is that this macro will not be accessible from any other program in the way that an EMF file will be. You can see there's a couple other commands here. One is the delete macro command. So if you have a macro command that you've saved with the ease file, you can delete it. If you have an EMF file that you've just loaded, you wouldn't delete that here, you would just close it. So you can see here if I go to macro2.emf, it's just going to be close macro. You can reopen it using the open macro file command in the macros menu. Macro commands can be logged to an external .log or .log file as they are executed. A lot of times that's a good way to see what's going on and debug a macro. These macro commands are also displayed here in the bottom pane as they are executed. And we're going to talk a little more about this log in a later video, but this clear log file command here clears the log information. The macro toolbar sits over here on the right side of the macro window, and you can see it has 9 buttons. The functions of these buttons are pretty self-explanatory, and they are going to operate on whatever macro you have in the forefront, so whatever macro is currently shown in the macro window. You can see some of these buttons are play, so this would actually play the macro, which just means start executing the commands. Pause means stop temporarily, and then stop is this red button. It means just stop executing macro commands. You can save or open macros that are saved as EMF files. So if I want to load an EMF file, I would select the open a new macro file here, open an existing macro file here. And then if I want to close it, I would hit the little X button that would close it. The question mark brings up the macro command information dialog, which is a really handy way of navigating between all of the macro commands. There's more than 100 of these, and you can just search here through all of them in the left window, or if you go to the right window, you can bunch them up according to function or type, and then search through a smaller subset. A particularly useful feature over here is the record macro commands button. And if this button is selected, then when the macro window is visible, the macro command equivalents of the instructions that you enter into ease with either the normal menu commands or with keystrokes will be entered into the foremost macro window by automatically, right? So you won't have to go look up, for example, what is the macro command to run a parametric table. If you're running a parametric table, that macro command will just appear here, right? So it's a very nice, easy way to make a macro that does something that you're doing sort of naturally. Let's do that here. Let's, in this case, just make a real simple program where A is equal to B squared. So I might want to plot, A is a function of B or B is a function of A. So what I'm going to do now is turn on recording in order to make a macro that runs this. So builds a parametric table, runs the table, and makes the plot. So you can see here the word recording shows up here, right? That tells me that I'm recording my keystrokes as macro commands. What I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and make a parametric table, and it'll include A and B, and hit OK, and there's a little faint popping noise, and that popping noise accompanies the inserting of that command, the macro equivalent of that operation here in the macro window. I'm going to vary A from, let's say, 1 to 5 or something like that, and hit OK, and you can see that the macro command equivalent of that appears here. And then I'll solve the table, and now you have the macro equivalent of that. And finally, I'm going to make a plot. And once I do that, you get the macro equivalent of that. So now I never have to do those keystrokes or those manipulations again. Here, if I delete the plot, I'll delete the table. And now I'm just going to hit the play button, and you can see it does all the stuff I just did, but automatically, right? This is incredibly handy because I don't have to search for the right macro command corresponding to whatever task that I'm doing. It just shows up here. And even if you just get close, the macro window here is editable, so I can just modify these commands in the way that I want and delete them if I want to do that. If you're done recording, you just hit this record button again, and now you're not recording anymore. What else? If I want to add tabs or comment some of these macro commands, I can do that. One way to do that is I can just select the line or lines I want to comment out, and then right click, and you can see I get this pop-up menu, and one of the choices here is comment or uncomment, so I'll just comment out these lines. You can do some other things here like set tabs and other sort of useful functionality for manipulating your macro program. All right, so our next video is going to be an exercise, actually, where we create a simple macro that just sort of gets us started on building and then also using macro commands.